Building a custom subwoofer enclosure that is designed to get the best performance for the model of subwoofer that you're using and the vehicle you are putting it in is key. But equally important is building the subwoofer box the right way. So what are 10 important build tips that we should follow that will not only have our subwoofer box sounding amazing and crushing those lows, but also look incredible? Let's find out. What's going on, guys? I'm Mark. Welcome to Car Audio Fabrication, the show where together we learn how to master car audio and how to design, build, and install our dream car audio system. So tip number one right off the bat is having a good plan to build from before you get started. Having a good build plan is key because we're going to know exactly what size we need to cut each of the different pieces that will go into our subwoofer enclosure. It's important to understand that a ported subwoofer enclosure design needs to have that port be calculated. In other words, a ported box isn't just a box with a hole in it. We need to take into account the cross-sectional area of that hole, the port that's going in and out of the box, and we also need to take into account the length of that port along with the air volume internally of the enclosure. These different values together will help to determine the tuning frequency of the subwoofer enclosure. It's all things that we need to consider, and even if we're doing a sealed subwoofer enclosure, we also want to determine that internal air volume. The air volume and tuning and these other details help to control the response of the subwoofer. In other words, how it's actually going to play, how low it will play, how loud it's going to get. These are all things that we want to take into account before we start building. A shameless plug, if you do need help with a subwoofer box blueprint that you can build from, I have them on my website. I can make them for you. I'd love to help you out. You can check that out at CarAudioFabrication.com. Box building tip number two, make sure that you properly spread out all of the wood glue on the different joints that are going to come together. I see this all the time where guys will just run a single bead of glue and then they sandwich those pieces together and they start attaching everything. You want to make sure that you have 100% surface coverage between those two different pieces to get the best bond. It's really important to understand that with these wooden subwoofer enclosures, it's the wood glue that is truly holding everything together a lot more so than the fasteners that you're actually going to use to temporarily hold the pieces in place while that wood glue dries. You don't have to have any fancy brushes or anything like that. Just throw a glove on your hand and smooth it out and get that perfect coverage. Box build tip number three, you want to secure that wiring. What do I mean by this? Well, obviously your subwoofer needs to have speaker wiring attached to it, but when you're really going ham on those subwoofers and listening to them loud, odds are that that air that's reverberating inside the enclosure can make a speaker wire potentially vibrate against the edge of the box. To help solve this potential annoying noise issue, what you can do is you can take some closed cell foam and you can wrap it around the wire and secure it in place with something like a cloth tape, or you could use screws and mechanical means to hold the wire in place. You could even use glue if you really wanted to. The point is, do something to make sure that those wires aren't vibrating if possible. Speaking of wiring, I do want to take a quick second to thank our sponsor for this episode, New Concepts. New Concepts has a wide variety of different wire available for your custom car audio system needs. Speaker wire, power wire, RCA signal wires, and more. Additionally, they have tons of fuse distribution blocks and other connections needed for a full system. My current truck system that I'm working on has all New Concepts gear. Their gear is high quality, very affordable, and I've used them for many, many years, long before I ever even started this YouTube channel. So if you guys want to check them out for your next build, you can do so at the link down in the video description. Build tip number four, add strength to your subwoofer enclosure, and a good couple of ways you can do this are with bracing and double baffles. The baffle is the face of the enclosure that the subwoofers actually mount to, and if you think about it, when we cut out those subwoofer holes, we're removing a lot of strength from that particular piece of wood. So the way to strengthen that back up is, first we could add 2 layers to the baffle so that it's twice as thick. And you can also add bracing inside the enclosure that attaches on the inside to the face of the baffle to prevent it from vibrating. Now do keep in mind that the amount of strength that you need to add to the enclosure does depend on how much power you're actually powering that subwoofer with. If you're only powering with, let's say, 250 watts or below, you're really not going to get all that much benefit from adding a double baffle or from adding bracing. They're not really required. They're always helpful, but not always required. Once you start to get into those higher power levels, you do definitely want to add that bracing. I see it quite often where people are almost bragging about the fact that their subwoofer box is flexing, moving in and out because it has so much power on those subwoofers. If you do build your enclosure and after the fact you find that it is moving, you can always go back and add bracing internally after the fact. Build tip number 5, utilize unique building features in order to match the vehicle. So what I mean by this is imagine the vehicle has some sort of curvature to it. We can always use techniques like stacking up stacked rounded corners, or we could even use kerfing, which is cutting a bunch of slots into the wood, allowing us to bend it. We can use those different strategies to match the interior design of a vehicle. This helps to make a subwoofer enclosure look like it fits within the vehicle more rather than just being a box. Build tip number 6, use the proper material to build your subwoofer enclosure. Now I understand there's acrylics and different types of plastic, but in this video we're going to focus on the main 2 woods that you should be using, which are MDF or Baltic birch. I've seen this quite often where people will say, you know, Baltic birch is very strong and it's a lot lighter than MDF, so we should always be using Baltic birch, but I actually disagree with that. The reason I disagree is MDF is a very dense material, and that's why it's really good for subwoofer enclosures. Because it's so dense, it is not very resonant. This means when you build a subwoofer enclosure out of MDF, you're not going to hear a resonant noise, you're going to hear just the subwoofer, as long as everything's properly braced. Now yes, that does apply to Baltic birch as well, but in my opinion, the amount of bracing that you really need to add to make a box as solid as if you were to just use that really dense, heavy MDF material, I don't really see the benefit. Now, I will add a footnote there though. If you're building some sort of huge, full wall type enclosure that takes up the full rear of a vehicle, you should absolutely be using the lightest material that you can, because if you're building a full wall out of MDF, that vehicle is going to be extremely heavy. So in summary, my main point here is use the material that makes the most sense for your application. Subwoofer box build tip number 7, get a woodworking router. Guys, please, if you watch this channel, I hope you all have one by now, but if you don't yet, get one today. Using a woodworking router makes the cuts for your subwoofer enclosure so much more perfect. As an example, imagine that we need to cut out the subwoofer cutout hole for a subwoofer. We could use a jigsaw and kind of very carefully go along, but even being super careful, you're still going to notice a slight inconsistency, and you might not have a perfect seal between the subwoofer and the enclosure. Using a woodworking router with a circle guide, you can even DIY your own circle guide if you need to. It's just a lot better. But there are so many more benefits that we can add to a subwoofer box other than just cutting circles with that woodworking router. Which brings me to tip number 8. If you are doing a ported enclosure, round over those edges of the port. You can use a router with a round over bit, and adding those rounded corners just allows that air to flow in and out of the port a lot more efficiently around those port edges without causing any noise. You could also use a roundover bit to smooth out the outside edges of a box so it doesn't have that super sharp 90-degree corner. If you guys are looking for a recommendation on a router, I have a related video about that here on the channel, or you can find a link down below. Box build tip number 9, add beauty panels to your design. You guys will see this all the time on the channel, whether it's a super complex ton of beauty panels that you fully frame out a subwoofer enclosure in a vehicle, or if it's just a few additions to a subwoofer box. Adding beauty panels to a subwoofer enclosure just gives it a far more unique look. And yes, I understand it's not necessarily going to benefit the sound performance of the subwoofer enclosure, but still, I'm tired of seeing these bare wood enclosures. I much rather see an enclosure that looks like it's made to be part of the vehicle or has some sort of unique features. Which brings me to build tip number 10. If you're building a subwoofer enclosure and you plan on wrapping it with these different wrapping materials, you need to take into account the gaps that you need to have for those wrapping materials while you are building the box. This is a far more advanced technique that advanced builders will really use to set their subwoofer enclosures apart. So if you guys want to learn more about that technique, you can check out the related videos here on the channel. So what other box building tips do you have that you would like to share with the community? I'd love to hear from you. If you want to see some full step-by-step box build videos, check out these. Next time you need wiring for a car audio build, check out our show sponsor, New Concepts, at the link down below. A special thanks to them along with Mike, Jerry, Mo, William, and the rest of the Patreon support team. A big thanks to all those guys for making these videos possible, and thank you for watching.